Welcome back, episode 2 of Recover Her podcast. I'm Heather Novak, here with my co-host, Tracey Oppenheim.
Hello.
Hi, Dr. Oppenheim.
How are you feeling today?
I'm feeling well-rested. Thanks for asking.
You are very welcome.
Yeah, I've been sleeping well lately. Yay.
Good.
It's a blessing.
Well, I am so excited about future guests we're going to have on this show, opportunities to interview all different types of people, but I can guarantee you that today is going to be my most favorite episode. Do you know why?
Why, Tracey? Dr. Oppenheim?
Because today we get to learn about your recovery journey. Yeah. I think your story is really, really powerful, and I know it's going to resonate with a lot of other people.
Well, thanks. Let's get into it. So when you say recovery, you're talking about my sobriety?
Crazy alcoholic brain is what I'm talking about. Let's get into that.
My crazy alcoholic brain. Okay. Yeah. Happy to share my story. So, my story of sobriety is an interesting one. It's definitely a story. And that's what you and I love so much about people, is that every single person has their own story,
Absolutely.
right? So I don't feel like I'm terribly unique. I'm just another.
I think you're very unique.
Thank you.
And you know, our stories, it's not just our stories, right? It's intergenerational. Right?
I have people in my life at recovery meetings that remind me, though, that I'm just another bozo on the bus. So I'm not that unique, right? But I do have a story that involves alcoholism, alcohol use disorder, alcoholism, and I identify with being a recovering alcoholic. So I will treat this episode 2 of Recover Her podcast in sharing my story just like I treat the recovery meetings that I find so helpful that I sit inside of.
When did alcohol first come into your life? And when I say that, not necessarily when was the first time that you drank alcohol, but when do you remember the first time you had an awareness of alcohol?
Yeah, I don't know if I ever existed in a time period where alcohol wasn't a part of my life. I had both my parents, my biological parents, were alcoholics. And even though that's not my story, it's definitely a part of my story that I can't get away from.
Absolutely.
Right? So, and I don't have any resentments over those people. My mother was 17 years old when she...
I don't know. When you say those people, that
people,
maybe applies a little bit of resentment.
No, but I don't. I've done the work and... Okay, take 2. Okay. Oh, that was funny. So I don't harbor resentment
towards those people.
My parents, because, to a certain degree, maybe we pick who our parents are. But my mom was a 17-year-old girl when she unintentionally became pregnant with me. And and that beginning, contentious beginning,
absolutely
started on an Indian reservation in northern Minnesota called White Earth Indian Reservation, where I was born and raised by that young girl in 1973. And the year that Roe versus Wade was passed, but she didn't have the resources or financial resources to travel to a big city like Minneapolis, for instance, and potentially have an abortion, which I believe she should have had every right to. When she found out she was pregnant at 17 with me. So from the very beginning, the relationship that I had with my mother was a very contentious one. And
I think, and I'm so sorry to interrupt, but I think you just already, like just in the first few minutes, brought up two things that are really important to highlight. Number one, there was the experience of your mom being a young person who's pregnant.
Right.
And I know you have said she was very vocal about not wanting to be pregnant, not wanting to have had you. And in fact, at one point, thought about trying to have an abortion, whether it was at a clinic or self-induced. And then you also mentioned, the Indian reservation, being born and raised on an Indian reservation where there's so much trauma.
So much trauma. Right. And now today, and even back then, alcoholism is so prevalent as far as a disease that runs rampant throughout reservations and that bloodline in particular. So anyway, Chippewa Nation on White Earth Indian Reservation was where I was born and raised, and I had incredible grandparents that definitely helped raise my brother and I, who is 4 years younger than I am. But from that period on, I remember raising, or at least attempting to raise my brother Aaron, who was 4 years younger. So I was a 4-year-old feeling responsible,
very
for
parentified already.
Yeah, for a baby. So we were in a little lake town called Detroit Lakes, Minnesota, right outside of the White Earth Indian Reservation, and my mom drove a little Datsun B210 stick shift. It was blue, and I remember being in the front seat, and Aaron was in a baby seat in the back. And he was an infant, so less than a year old. And my mom at the time I think she was 21 or 2, had pulled off onto this, it was called the Roadhouse Bar.
Oh, boy.
And she lived her 20s the way I lived my 20s, except I wasn't dragging around a couple of kids with me. And she had pulled over, gone inside the bar, and told Aaron and I, I'll be right back. And Aaron was, of course, sleeping, and I was waiting patiently. I don't know what I was doing in the car at the time, but just waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting. And she never came back. And Aaron woke up. He was hungry, started crying. I had picked him up out of the back seat and walked. So I was 4, a 4-year-old Heather holding this baby, walking inside this bar. And I found my mom in the middle of the afternoon, broad daylight, like riding a mechanical bull inside this bar. She was having the time of her life, but she had just simply forgotten that she had 2 kids.
And when you describe that memory, I'm wondering, can you recall anything about how you felt?
Well, I think I felt very alone. I felt very isolated. I felt responsible for Aaron. I felt scared.
Yes.
I felt abandoned.
Yes.
I would have turned and looked to anyone in an adult role to help fix, change, take care of me, to meet my basic needs that I think as children you deserve.
Yeah. So let's really hold on to those things that you just articulated, and let's see if that thread shows up in other ways in your story over the years.
Yeah. So then I had a pretty, what I perceived to be a pretty normal, I know that word is not even, shouldn't be a part of my vocabulary. I think
facts.
My normalcy just doesn't exist. I don't know what normal is, right? Like, it's just, I understand today, of course, that there's not everything is so black or white, that there's lots of different gray areas in life. But what I was going to say is my life just, hopping down the bunny trail seemed rather normal to me, but nothing about it was normal. My home was not a safe place to exist. I did seek out other families in the community that I lived in that were, I think, incredible role models. I sought out other people, other places, other things. I tried to make my life as beautiful and as happy, and that felt so much better than feeling threatened, scared, and alone. I modeled and looked for this perfectionism in life.
Okay. And when you say growing up, it's interesting to me. I think so many of us do this. What our experience is as children, we just assume is quote, normal
Yeah.
Despite
The
you know,
contrary, which it
yeah,
absolutely was not. Growing up in an alcoholic home where you have two parents, that it didn't feel laced in consequences that you typically would find with the disease of alcoholism. You know, somebody with a homeless brown paper bag that lives under a bridge. That was not my existence. Both my parents were professionals. They had some resources. And I've always told the story that nothing bad ever happened to Amy and Tom. Those were their names. And nothing bad ever happened to them, meaning that there were not severe consequences to their drinking. Besides, they had no attachments in relationships. They had no relationships with us as kids, their own kids. Nothing bad happened to them except that they're dead from the disease of alcoholism. So my biological father died of the disease when he was 48 years old. And then my mom proceeded to drink herself to death after he died, and she died of alcoholism at 52. And when I say died of alcoholism, she proceeded to, drink herself to death. And she fell in the middle of the night, hit her head in the bathroom, and bled to death internally because her organs were simply so compromised. So going backwards a little bit, I raised my brother, or at least I felt like that was my obligation to do because there were not adults around that you could count on.
Were you left alone often?
We were always left alone, but it was the 70s and 80s, again, normal for me, right? And so raising my brother, or doing the best that I could with at least thinking that was even, gave that a good attempt. And I became hyper independent as well.
Out of necessity.
So I had all these really useful behaviors that I needed as a child, and being put in lots of different crazy circumstances that were protection mechanisms that then later on in life, I still used so many of those protectors, if you will, that were no longer serving me as an adult woman, that were really useful when I was a kid in unsafe environments.
There's this image that you have painted for me before that really sticks with me. And it's of a little Heather on a porch.
Oh, right.
Can you describe that?
Yeah, I told that story when I went to IOP, which is intensive outpatient. That's the acronym for it. And I went to a place called the Meadows in Scottsdale, Arizona, for an IOP program that they offered. I think it was for 8 weeks during the week, maybe 8 a.m. to 1 p.m. every single day. And it offered a lot of different healing modalities that I know that we'll get into and talk about more down the road in other episodes. But trauma yoga, art, EMDR, somatic experience, biofeedback, a lot of great ways to start peeling away the layers of my onion to get to my authentic self, right? Once alcohol was removed from my system. And they had us do a trauma timeline. That's what it was. And that's basically just writing out anything that was really challenging or awful, all the bad things that happened to you that you can remember in your entire life. So I had memories from 4, including walking into the bar with my baby brother in my arms, finding my mom on a mechanical bull in the middle of the afternoon. But I also had a story about a 6-year-old version of me, 6-year-old Heather, that I was on a porch, and it was like it was a deck area, and I had gotten the flu. So I was so sick, and I was vomiting. It was coming out of both ends. I was shitting myself. I was a 6-year-old who was sick. And I know that there were other people around, but I just didn't feel safe to expose myself at all. And I remember, just that feeling, gasping for air, throwing up, diarrhea, all of it. And then grabbing a garden hose and cleaning up the deck and cleaning up my own clothes that I had soiled and vomit all over myself. And I pretended like I was okay. And I had to hide that fact. And I'm a mother today. And I remember when who is now a teenager, grown kind of man, but when he was a child, I remember when he threw up once. Because he didn't get sick a whole lot. And he had gotten the flu. And when Sam was vomiting, he literally thought he was dying.
That's right.
And I could mother him, of course, so differently than the way that I was treated. And, with so much love and just being able to hold him. And, of course, kind of healing myself through that process, too. Raising a child so differently, vastly differently than the way that I was raised. Again, I don't blame them for that because I do believe that, we don't know what we don't know, right? And we do the best that we can with what we know at the time. And my mom just didn't have the tools of recovery that I have been given. But back then, that 6-year-old Heather, I just probably felt like I was going to die, and I had no one to go to just to simply tell me it was going to be okay. So that was not instilled in me at all, this ability to trust others, to be able to receive love, obviously I knew all too well how to kind of take care of myself and to take care of another infant back then when it shouldn't have been my role to begin with.
And you talk about hyper independence,
right?
And how you carry these coping mechanisms forward in adult life. So how did that hyper independence show up for you in other relationships?
Well, I think that along with my own alcoholism, that I also developed a really strong dependence in codependency relationships, codependency. And I remember when I went to IOP at the Meadows, I assumed that there were going to be that I would be sitting there with a bunch of other recovering alcoholics or people that were struggling to give up alcohol, and maybe some drug addicts sprinkled in, and I was so wrong and surprised by that, because the majority of the people that were there with me, and this was over 6-7 years ago now, but they were there dealing with issues of depression, anxiety, and codependency. And that just floored me, because I had no idea, Tracey, that I was so codependent.
Can you explain a little bit what that means for you?
I've learned as I've gotten a lot healthier the difference between codependent relationships, which just are laced in a lot of dependency, right? It's just because I didn't have that, I searched for that so much in my adult relationships, to answer your question. So it can become a very unhealthy coping mechanism in codependency. And today I've learned how so much more as I've grown and aged and learned within my sobriety as my foundation of my healing, that being interdependent with another human, with other humans, is just a beautiful existence. It's so much safer to be interdependent and have this giving and receiving inside relationship than it is of codependence.
Does that feel like fixing to you, or looking outside yourself to be fixed?
Definitely.
Okay.
Looking outside yourself to be fixed. You can fix me. You can help me. You can change me. It's a latching on of dependency that really started back from the roots of my childhood trauma.
Okay.
So it was kind of unavoidable. It was just the path that I experienced, so that I adopted and kept carrying into my adult life. So, coming back to my story a little bit, I went to high school and went to college, was seeking out different forms of course, education, and still today love to learn and grow and to show up one day at a time with a beginner's mind to learn new concepts. I thrive in that space, and I'm grateful for that.
So I got to know, when did you first start boozing it up? How old were you?
Well, it felt normal to me. That word, normal, again.
Yep.
It was a normal, I grew up, it was a small town. It was easy access to be able to get alcohol. Nobody really cared. There wasn't any talk of a drinking age. It was almost unusual if you didn't drink.
High school or middle school?
High school. It was in high school when I think I took my first drink. Maybe I was 15 or 16. I remember where we were, Sarah and Jeff and Brian. We were all in a car and we would drink beer, and it was just pretty benign. There wasn't any, but that was the first time in high school.
Do you remember what that feeling was like the first time alcohol hit your bloodstream?
I don't remember. I remember that feeling of that. I know what it ended up progressing or turning into.
Interesting.
I think is more something I can relate to with my story versus the first time alcohol touched my lips. It was because it really wasn't. It was just something to do and experience.
Okay.
Checked it off the list like a teenager.
Okay.
College, normal drinking experience in my mind. But then things did progress to the point where I felt a certain freedom when I poured alcohol on inside, when alcohol touched my lips, that I could simply feel like it was a matter of something that helped me take the edge off, that helped me slow down, that helped me not give a shit, that helped me not worry about the realities of life, that it just sort of helped me step into more of this fantasy land that I always wanted to create. So I found it very helpful.
Talk to me about that fantasy land.
Well, there's a lot of nuance into that. I think that it has historically been very easy for me to put on lots of different types of masks. And I've tried on lots of different roles in my life. And I've loved my life.
Yes.
I have no regrets over any of it. The relationships I've experienced, the beginnings and the endings of things, that I do have this ability to just keep putting one foot in front of the other. And I enjoy the aspect of life of I'm curious about keep coming back, because it's not easy, and it's definitely not easy when at the couple of times in my life that I've experienced that alcohol was a problem, because I, like my parents, didn't suffer severe consequences to my drinking, meaning I never had a DUI. I was never in trouble with the law. I think there were some experiences back when I was a teenager, but other than that, it didn't seem to wreak havoc or destroy my adult life. And I think if you took a poll of the people that surrounded me in my 20s, I quit drinking initially when I was 26 years old after the death of my biological father, because I just simply thought and believed that I could do something that he couldn't do, and that was to quit alcohol. I don't remember, there's not a memory of him in my life when he didn't have vodka in his hand, even though he was functioning. It was a different time. Everybody was driving with alcohol. We'd go back and forth between our lake in Minnesota and back to Fargo, and there was just alcohol was pervasive.
And I think that's such an important point too, in terms of the power of modeling within a family around alcohol,
Right.
and then also, as we've talked about many times, just how pervasive alcohol is, how much it's
Right.
held up, glamorized
Right.
in our world. So you get through high school, you go to college. Are you binge drinking, or are you? I know you say you feel like it was normal, but when
Right.
you look back on
Yeah.
it now as a sober woman, does it feel excessive?
Well, I learned inside of the recovery meetings that some signs of blackouts, for instance,
Yes.
that I experienced for sure in college, that's simply a progression of the disease of alcoholism. So I had blackouts for sure in college, but would just, was younger and could get up and keep doing what I was doing. But there were plenty of times where I didn't remember how I got home, who drove home, maybe even where my clothes are from the night before. There were lots of problematic situations that happened. I just didn't have the severe consequences of really being caught. So at 26 years old was what my first attempt at being sober. And I was sober for 14 years. I didn't take a drink of alcohol from 26 until I turned 40.
And so what was the impetus for that? I know you said your dad died. That triggered something within you in terms of like, I want to quit, prove that I can quit.
Right.
But what else was going on at that time that led you to recovery?
I had started a yoga practice, and I had met a group of men that were all, I didn't know that they were sober. I didn't know that they were a part of any 12-step recovery groups. And we would go out for dinner after yoga, and I would have a glass of wine. I wasn't like drinking excessively every single day either. A lot of people think that if you're an alcoholic, you're a blackout drunk every single day, and that, then it's a problem. And that wasn't my story as far as my level of drinking. There's, again, I said that I can relate. At the very beginning, I brought up that I'm very black or white or all or nothing. Yes. I think that is a type A personality trait, but it also is a part of my disease of alcoholism. And today I know that there's this massive gray area that encompasses alcohol use disorder.
Big spectrum.
Big spectrum. So it's not just normal drinker or an alcoholic. There's all sorts of nuances in between there that account for alcohol use disorder. So
you were called, death of your father. And was it that you understood that his death was related to his alcoholism? And did you feel scared, or was it more coming from a place of ego of I want to be better than this man? Or were you starting to really understand that the alcoholism was keeping you from something?
Well, when you watch someone struggle with the disease of alcoholism, as I have definitely done over the years, I have a very intimate relationship with the disease. I've watched people die. I've watched people take their lives. I've watched green people sit next to me inside of 12-step meetings. That you often feel some relief when someone dies because you know that they're out of the grips of that disease of suffering, right? So I had met a group of guys at yoga, and we'd go out to eat afterwards. I'd have a glass of wine. Nobody was drinking, and it led into deeper discussions about life in general. And they seemed to kind of have some answers that I so desperately wanted. So they had something that I wanted. And I'm not talking about a car or a house. They had something that I wanted. And it was like this inner knowing. With a capital K, which today I believe is God inside of you and in me, that capital K knowing. and they seemed several of them had long-term sobriety, and I became really curious about that. That beginner's mind was stoked.
Like, what is it? Like, what is
me.
this
You're
sobriety
like, why
thing?
do you know this?
Okay.
How do you know how to handle life on life's terms? How do you, whatever situation with the ebb and flow that life is designed to be, that some of these new friends of mine seem to have the answer. And often it was, let go, let God, or some of the slogans that seemed just too easy to, and they were so at peace with it. And I wasn't at peace.
Simple but not easy, right?
Yeah, I wasn't at peace at all. And I really wanted what they had, right? So one of them in particular gave me a book called Adult Children of Alcoholics. And I read that book, and it was just an immediate exhale.
Blown your mind.
It blew my mind, but it also was like the key to my soul.
Yeah.
It was an understanding for me, Tracey, to really be able to pinpoint those really useful childhood behaviors that I had in those unsafe environments.
Yes.
That from the 4-year-old Heather to 6-year-old Heather, like all of that they were useful behaviors that I was carrying into my adult life that were no longer serving me, and quite frankly were pretty detrimental to the relationships that I had at that time. Okay. So it started me off on this journey of, what does Taylor Swift say? Like, I'm the problem, it's me.
Yep.
That I'm the common denominator in all the things I see unfit with my life. And sometimes that can be an overwhelming pill to swallow. But I read that book, Adult Children of Alcoholics, and found a lot of freedom. It was, again, like a key to my soul of understanding, really for the first time, and even simple language of why I was the way that I was.
Yes. So an awareness.
Yeah, it was an awareness, which
awareness.
I truly believe is kind of the most important factor in all healing. Because if you don't know something is a problem, then it's not a problem, right? If a person, and you sure do on an individual level, have the ability to bring something from the unconscious into the conscious mind, and then you have an awareness. It's not as important, in my never to be so humble opinion, to know, well, how am I going to get sober, and what's going to happen? Am I going to lose my friends? Am I going to not have a life? Is this going to be so boring? Or how am I going to stay sober for the rest of it? That's creating a life of full anxiety, of thinking about the fear of the unknown future.
And that is a very common experience that we all have, to keep us, allegedly to keep us safe, right? Because change, even though the change can be for good, is still feels unsafe to your nervous system.
Absolutely. Then you're in the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn.
So that's such an important connection.
Yeah,
that
it's a
you
good
make,
distinction
that
to make,
you,
for sure.
That you had this awareness and you started getting curious, right? Like, I love the idea of curiosity. Whatever, let's just get curious.
Yeah,
we don't have to think about anything down the line. But your system is hardwired to know, oh shit, she's about to do something different.
Yep,
so whatever we can do
to protect her,
keep her the same,
yep.
we're going to do. So okay, so eventually you found yourself in 12-step
in recovery
in a
meetings.
room. Do you remember how you experienced your first meeting?
Yeah, I definitely do. It was at a little Jewish temple.
Shalom. Let's go, recovery.
In Scottsdale. And it was a small meeting, a mixed meeting. I think it wasn't even an open meeting, which means anyone is welcome. And the only requirement for membership is a desire to stop drinking. And I went, I have that. And I had from childhood a hyper independence of doing everything on my own. But I knew that I didn't want to do this on my own, that I needed other people, because I had had that experience with these other men that I had become so close with in the rooms of yoga. Having that fellowship and other people around you is just such a beautiful insulation and helpful container to heal.
I just got to know, because I know my first experience walking into a 12-step room was during my psychiatry training,
Okay.
because it was
you got a sneak peek
it was an assignment, like,
because
go.
you're like a normie.
So 26-year-old Heather walks into her first recovery meeting. I want to know, like, really, like, what did it feel like? What was your mind telling you? What was your body telling you? What did it feel like?
It was terrifying. Like a car crash.
All right, we're just starting to get into your recovery journey. And I think this is a good place to take a pause. There's a lot that comes up, and I want us to be able to continue, talking openly and full of energy. So thank you so much for being willing to, bare your soul. And we're going to go deeper in episode 3 with your recovery story.